Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Dark Knight Returns. Now, The Dark Knight Returns is a graphic novel written and illustrated by Frank Miller, with Klaus Jensen as the inker, and Lynn Varley, who was married to Frank Miller at the time, as the colorist. And this was published by DC Comics, and features the character of Batman, originally created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger, as well as the character of Superman, originally created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Now, this was first published as a 4-issue comic book series in 1986. Then later on, those 4 issues were collected into one graphic novel or trade paperback, whichever you want to call it. I mean, comic book fans debate left and right what actually constitutes as a graphic novel. For me, even if it is originally published as a limited series, as long as those issues put together tell one self-contained open and shut story, then I can count it as a graphic novel, even though I'll admit I'm guilty of misusing the term graphic novel as well. But I also don't mind calling this comic a graphic novel, because kind of like Alan Moore's Watchmen, there are points where this almost does read as a novel. Now, Frank Miller is also the writer of comics like Ronin, 300, and Sin City. And around this time, he also had his acclaimed run on Daredevil, which he did for Marvel. Now, this is the first of this year's series of Batman reviews, something I do every year. Now, I actually did review this book back in 2013, when I first started doing these Batman reviews, and that review is still up, however, it's no longer public. It's now marked as unlisted, but you can see it with a link, and I'll leave a link in the description below to where you can check out my 2013 review of Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns. I just wanted to re-review it because I've read this book a couple of times since then, and I feel like there's so much more I can say about it now. And not only do I think this is the best Batman comic ever written, this is also one of my top 15 favorite books of all time. Now, both this and Alan Moore's Watchmen really did sort of change the comic book industry at the time, and the comic book world is still feeling the effects of these books even today. And for better or worse, these are the comics that kind of created what we would now call the dark and gritty superhero story. And I would say this and Watchmen, and to a certain extent Neil Gaiman's Sandman series, and even though this next example I'm gonna bring up isn't superhero or DC related, something like Art Spiegelman's Mouse, these comics really showed that comic books can be for adults as well, and can tell very complex, mature stories, and can be political or philosophical, or say something profound about society, or can even qualify as literature. This comic also showed, at least the mainstream, that something like Batman can be taken seriously, because you gotta understand, at the time this came out, most of the mainstream's perception of Batman was the 60s Adam West show, which was notoriously goofy, and intentionally so. Now, the evolution of Batman has always interested me. If you go back to the early Batman comics from the late 30s and early 40s, while they were certainly goofy by today's standards, they took themselves relatively seriously, and they tried to present themselves as these dark crime stories, especially the first Batman comic ever written, The Case of the Chemical Syndicate. But over time, the comics got progressively goofier and goofier, especially when you got into the 50s and 60s, and you had the Comics Code, where comic book writers and artists were kind of strong-armed into making comic books more kid-friendly. And then the goofier, campier Batman comics of the 50s and 60s is what inspired the Adam West TV show, which was basically a comedy. And then you had the 70s cartoon and stuff like Super Friends, and Scooby-Doo meets Batman and Robin, and Batman certainly was an icon, but as far as the mainstream was concerned, he was kind of this goofy character. But by the 70s and 80s, the comics were starting to become a little bit more mature, especially with the stuff that Denny O'Neil was doing. But this comic, The Dark Knight Returns, this really was sort of a turning point for the character, again, at least as far as the general public was concerned. Like, this was a much more violent and gritty and more adult Batman story than we were used to up until this point. And for me, this is so much more than just a Batman story. Like, I almost look at this as more of a dystopic crime novel / political satire that just happens to feature Batman and Jim Gordon and other characters from the Batman mythos. And I honestly would recommend this even if you know nothing about Batman. Like, in a lot of ways, this almost feels like Clockwork Orange meets Dirty Harry meets Taxi Driver meets Blade Runner meets Mad Max. Now, the plot of The Dark Knight Returns is it's set in either the not-too-distant future or sort of an alternate present, and keep in mind that the story is set outside of the mainstream DC continuity, but it's set in a world where characters like Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, and other well-known DC characters exist, but in this timeline they've been inactive for the past 10 years because the government outlawed superheroes, with the exception of Superman, who's now working for the US government. But the book is primarily set in Gotham City and follows an aging, depressed Bruce Wayne who has been retired as Batman for the past 10 years, but it's implied that the main reason he quit was not because of the government orders, but because of the death of Jason Todd, who was the second Robin. And crime in Gotham City is now at an all-time high, and the city is being terrorized by this gang known as the Mutants, and it's implied that all over the country crime rates are just as bad, and also it appears that tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union have gotten to a point where it seems like World War III is imminent, so it seems like society as we know it is starting to fall apart. And while all this is going on, in the beginning of the story, you find out that Gotham's former district attorney, Harvey Dent, who became the supervillain known as Two-Face, he has gotten facial reconstructive surgery, and it appears that his psychological scars as well as his physical scars have been fixed, so it seems that Two-Face is completely recovered and he's released from Arkham. But now it seems that Harvey Dent might be going back to his criminal ways. So all the violence caused by the mutants and the possible return of Two-Face prompts Bruce Wayne to come out of retirement and once again become Batman, but since the world has become a darker place, Batman has come back a little bit darker and meaner than he was before. So, Batman's return takes the media and the country by storm, with there being people who are pro-Batman and people who are anti-Batman. And inspired by the Dark Knight's return, this teenage girl named Carrie Kelly wants to become the new Robin, and Batman gladly takes her under his wing. But Batman's return also prompts the return of his greatest adversary, the Joker, who has been in a catatonic state for the past 10 years. And all of this is really upsetting the United States government, and the story ultimately culminates in a fight between Superman and Batman at the end of the story. Now, one thing that's really fascinating about this comic is how it explores the psychology of Bruce Wayne / Batman, and shows that Batman might be just as psychotic as his enemies. Now, I love Batman as a character, he's my favorite superhero, but let's face it, if somebody like Batman existed in real life, you would want to avoid this motherfucker. Like, somebody like Batman in real life would be fucking scary. And this comic kinda shows that, and I also like how Bruce Wayne's Batman persona is not so much portrayed as an alter ego for Bruce Wayne, rather it's almost like a completely alternate personality that Bruce Wayne has been keeping suppressed for the past 10 years, but now it's finally taken over again. There's almost the implication that there's something supernatural about it, as if this is a demon or an avenging angel possessing Bruce Wayne. Now, in the comic, a gang forms called the Sons of Batman, which is sort of a splinter group from the Mutants, and the Sons of Batman, they're violent vigilantes who legitimately go too far, where they outright kill the criminals that they fight, and they even punish people for the most minor of offenses. Like, you find out that they chop the hands off a young shoplifter, and they even cut the fingers off of a shop owner for not defending his shop hard enough. So, the Sons of Batman are not good guys at all, but you never see Batman try to stop them in the story. He does technically stop the Sons of Batman at the end, but it's only to get them to join forces with him out of necessity, given what happens towards the end of the comic. That being said, you can still tell from the tone of the comic that Frank Miller still wants us to root for Batman, but I think he wants us to almost look at Batman almost as a necessary evil. And this whole idea of Batman being not all that different from his enemies is reflected in the whole subplot with Two-Face, which I found to be so heartbreaking. Harvey Dent is my favorite Batman villain, and in the story you have Harvey Dent who, when he was in Arkham, they fixed his face, but you realize that they only fixed the physical scars. They didn't fix the psychological scars. In fact, they kind of made the psychological scars even worse, where you realize that even though in reality Harvey Dent looks perfectly normal, in his mind, he looks like his entire face is fucked up now. And I like how, even though this is a much more brutal version of Batman, he still shows Harvey Dent some compassion, where when Dent tells him to look at him, Batman says, "I see a reflection, Harvey." To show that they're, no pun intended, basically two sides of the same coin. They're both people who are made what they are by trauma, but neither one of them can escape from their trauma. They're both consumed by it and defined by it. Also, I can't talk about this book without also talking about the Mutants, who are just terrifying villains, especially their leader. The mutant leader really does feel like a character straight out of a horror movie. He's a complete psychopath, and the final battle between Batman and the mutant leader is freaking brutal. The book's characterization of the Joker is also really interesting, where the Joker, and this has been played around with in so many Batman comics since this, but it's this whole idea that the Joker can't exist without Batman. For the past 10 years since Batman's been in retirement, the Joker has been in a catatonic state, and now that Batman has returned, the Joker comes out of this catatonic state. He has a reason to exist now. And there's this whole implication that the Joker loves Batman, he keeps referring to him as darling, and I also think it's really interesting how the final battle between Batman and Joker in this comic takes place in a tunnel of love at an amusement park. I also think it's really interesting how Superman is made out to be kind of a villain in the story. Now, you understand where he's coming from, but the whole idea is basically that Superman has sold out to the government. Also, kind of like Dr. Manhattan in Watchmen, Superman has basically been made into America's live-in nuclear deterrent. I also really liked the relationship between Bruce Wayne and Jim Gordon in this, where Gordon finally realizes that Bruce Wayne was Batman, and I've always found Jim Gordon to be such an important character in the Batman mythos, and in some ways he is just as much of a hero as Batman is. And between this and Batman Year One, Frank Miller is really good at writing Jim Gordon. Now, in the comic, he is a little sexist. In the comic, he's retiring, and he's being replaced with a female commissioner, and at one point he says, "A woman, Christ almighty." But in the comic you also find out that in this timeline he served in World War II, so this is a guy from the older generation, and so much of the comic is about how the world is changing for better or worse. Now, I know Frank Miller has been accused of sexism in his later comics, but in this you have the character of Carrie Kelly, who is an amazing character. Yes, there are points where she is very vulnerable, but that's because she's a kid. She's only a 13-year-old girl. But she's shown to be extremely intelligent and extremely strong-willed. And in the comic, her and Batman do develop kind of a father-daughter relationship, and it very much seems that she sees a father figure in Bruce, because it is implied that her own parents are very neglectful of her. And she's also kind of the thing that keeps Bruce grounded in the story, that keeps him from going full psychopath. And there are a lot of sweet, tender moments between them. And speaking of cute moments in what is a very violent comic, at a certain point Batman saves this little boy from the Joker, and then the Joker's getting away, and the little boy says, "Go get him, Batman, kick his ass!" And then Batman's like, "Son, watch your language." In the comic, you have the character of Dr. Wolper, who is such a douchebag, but he's sort of a well-meaning douchebag, because I don't think he's an evil character at all. Like, he does legitimately think he's helping people, but he's not doing a very good job at it. Like, he gets Harvey Dent released from Arkham when he clearly wasn't ready to be released, and also what happens with the Joker later on in the comic is basically Dr. Wolper's fault. I'm not sure if this character was meant to be Frank Miller's criticism of the mental health system or something, but you can tell that this character is definitely meant to be very satirical. Also, the character of Oliver Queen, better known as Green Arrow, shows up at the end of the comic, and I really liked what Frank Miller did with Green Arrow. Now, as I pointed out before, Dark Knight Returns is also very much a political satire. It's a satire on American politics and on the Cold War, and it's very much a satire on the media. And in some ways, this book was kind of prophetic. Like, it predicted things like the 24-hour news cycle, and it sort of predicted the media circuses that we would get later on. It also kind of predicted, granted, I'm sure the media did this even back then, but it kind of predicted how certain news agencies and certain media outlets would twist a story around to fit a narrative or to fit their agenda. For example, there's a scene in this comic where a crazy guy goes into a porno theater and he shoots 3 people. Now, you find out the reason he did this is because he saw some preacher on television talking about how if you listen to Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven backwards, it's actually an homage to Satan. But when this is reported on the news, it's reported as a Batman-inspired shooting. Now, unfortunately, we did have a theater shooting in real life back in 2012, and unfortunately a lot of people have pointed their fingers at this comic, when in reality, violent media is the last thing that we should be pointing our fingers at in situations like that. Also, the fact that the Joker appears on a talk show at one point in this comic kind of predicted how we would make celebrities out of serial killers and psychopaths. Now, from what I understand, Frank Miller politically does lean more towards the right, and some people have accused him of kind of going off the deep end in recent years, and I would say that Frank Miller's politics definitely show even in something like this, where it definitely does make fun of the left, but I would argue that it also makes fun of the right as well. Like, the graphic novel is actually very critical of the Reagan administration, to a point where Ronald Reagan is a character in the comic. But he's not portrayed in the most positive of lights. He's actually portrayed as kind of a doofus. Now, I do gotta give some words on Frank Miller's artwork in this. The artwork in this comic, it goes from being kind of realistic to ultra-stylized to even abstract at some points. Now, I like Frank Miller's stories, but I'm not the biggest fan of his artwork. It's just not really my cup of tea. But in the case of Dark Knight Returns, I didn't like the artwork when I first read the comic, but over time this artwork has definitely grown on me to a point where now I can't imagine the story without this artwork. Like, honestly, I don't think this comic would have worked as well if it was illustrated by Stephen Passett or Dave Gibbons or Neil Adams or something. So again, while Frank Miller's art is not really my cup of tea, for this story it does work. But yeah, The Dark Knight Returns is an amazing comic. Not only is it a great Batman story, it's a great science fiction novel, it's a great political satire, it's a great dystopian novel, it's a great crime drama, it's a great action thriller. It's just a great book overall. Now, for all the praise I'm giving this graphic novel, I will say, though, I do think Alan Moore's Watchmen is the better book. The only reason I'm bringing Watchmen up is I do think Watchmen actually makes a very interesting companion piece to Dark Knight Returns. Now, as I pointed out before, both this and Watchmen really did sort of change the comic book industry at the time, and this influenced so much, but I actually want to bring up two movies that might have been inspired by this comic in some way. One is the original Robocop. Like, the world of Robocop reminded me a lot of the world of Dark Knight Returns. And yes, I know Robocop was also inspired by Judge Dredd, but I would not be surprised if maybe that movie took some inspiration from this comic as well. And I don't know if it's a coincidence that Frank Miller would go on to write the Robocop sequels. Also, in the comic, when Harvey Dent returns to his criminal ways, he wraps himself up in bandages, and I always felt he looked a lot like Darkman from Sam Raimi's Darkman, so I would not be surprised if the look for Darkman was maybe somewhat inspired by Harvey Dent's look in this comic. Now, right after this, Frank Miller wrote Batman Year One, which for a while became the definitive Batman origin story. Now, I like Year One, but I'm not as crazy about it as other people are. I actually find it to be somewhat overrated, but I do respect what it inspired, because Year One became almost just as influential as Dark Knight Returns. Now, Frank Miller has done other Batman comics since this, but none of his other Batman comics have really had the same impact as Dark Knight Returns in Year One. But in 2001 and 2002, he wrote a sequel to The Dark Knight Returns called The Dark Knight Strikes Again, and the less we know about that comic, the better. Trust me. There's also another sequel to The Dark Knight Returns called The Dark Knight 3, The Master Race, which Frank Miller co-wrote with Brian Azzarello, and I've heard that one is significantly better than The Dark Knight Strikes Again, and I actually do like Brian Azzarello, but given how much of a piece of crap Strikes Again was, I'm not sure if I'm really gonna go out of my way to read that one anytime soon. Now, Carrie Kelly actually would appear in other Batman comics not written by Frank Miller, like, she would actually appear in some of the Batman comics of the New 52 timeline. Now, with both this and Batman Year One, Frank Miller really did set the stage for these darker, more grounded Batman stories, and he really did sort of set the template for stuff like Alan Moore's The Killing Joke and Grant Morrison's Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth. And for all intents and purposes, Dark Knight Returns also sort of set the stage for the 1989 Tim Burton Batman movie. Carrie Kelly actually appeared in an episode of the New Batman Adventures in the 90s, which was a sequel to Batman the Animated Series. The episode she appeared in was called Legends of the Dark Knight, which in and of itself was actually loosely based on a Batman comic from the 70s called The Batman Nobody Knows. But the episode was about a group of kids who debate who or what Batman actually is, and they each give their own interpretations of Batman. But in that episode, Carrie Kelly imagines a scenario where she's Robin, and you get a direct adaptation of the mutant scene from Dark Knight Returns, and also in that episode, the great Michael Ironside voiced the Dark Knight Returns Batman. You could also see the influence of Dark Knight Returns on a show like Batman Beyond, which was another sequel to Batman the Animated Series. Dark Knight Returns also had a huge influence on Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy. Like, the Tumblr from those movies was so clearly inspired by the way the Batmobile looks in Dark Knight Returns. And then in The Dark Knight, you realize that Batman's activities have inspired copycats, and that was clearly inspired by the Sons of Batman from this comic. Also, Heath Ledger's Joker in The Dark Knight, while that was definitely inspired by Alan Moore's version of the Joker from The Killing Joke, I also would not be surprised if Heath Ledger maybe took some inspiration from Frank Miller's version of the Joker from this comic. Also, the third film of Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy, The Dark Knight Rises, takes direct plot elements from The Dark Knight Returns. In fact, there's a scene in that movie that is ripped off almost completely from Dark Knight Returns. Now, there was an official adaptation of The Dark Knight Returns, which was a two-part animated film. Part 1 was released in 2012, and Part 2 was released in 2013, and I loved the animated film. I actually think it's probably the best of the DC animated films that DC has been putting out for the past decade. I don't want to spend too much time talking about the animated film because about 2 years ago, me and my friends did a 3-part retrospective on all the animated Batman films, and I think we talked about this movie in part 2, and we spent, I think, like a half hour talking about this movie, so if you want to know more of my thoughts on this movie, just check out that retrospective. And then me and my friend Eric reviewed the 2-part movie back in 2014. But the movie was very faithful to the comic. It did streamline a lot of things, and it did cut out a lot from the comic, and also, the movie kept a lot of the satire from the comic, but since the movie did not come out in the 80s like the comic did, I don't think the satire was anywhere near as hard-hitting. But still, the movie is definitely worth a watch if you're a fan of the graphic novel, and I thought Peter Weller was perfect to voice this version of Batman. Now, the Mutants have also appeared in the show Gotham. Now, in 2019, you had the Todd Phillips film Joker, which was a reimagining of the Joker's origin, but it was done as a realistic character drama rather than a straightforward comic book movie. But there's a scene at the end of the movie that is directly inspired by a scene from The Dark Knight Returns. But the influence of Dark Knight Returns is everywhere. Honestly, who's to say what Batman would be like today if Dark Knight Returns never existed? Now, before I end this video, I want to cut to some friends of mine giving their thoughts on this classic graphic novel.
So here we are at last talking about the big one, Dark Knight Returns. The thing that's so great about it is it came out that year when comic books started to grow up. Watchmen had just come out, and, well, I don't know, just came out, but yeah, they came out around the same time, and it was a signal that these stories were starting to grow up, and they were kind of growing up with their audience, because their audience was now the ones who were writing them. Frank was like a big Batman fan, big Superman fan, and he just dived right in and was like, all right, let me make this my own, and let me see what we can do if we take it seriously. I think it's so imaginative, and it reinterprets Batman in such an amazing, cool way. Like, all right, here's how he would be in a dystopia. Here's Bruce in a world where everybody's gone. The heroes are gone. Hope is kind of starting to die. And it doesn't affect him as adversely because he's about fear, not hope. So, like, he's maintaining, but at the same time, he's just not Batman anymore. And something has to change, and something's got to... Sometimes it's a blunt instrument that has to set things right. That's why Clark is kind of the villain of the story, for lack of a better term. More like he's the antagonist of the story, which is brilliant, because to think of the idea of Superman being the opposing figure, you know, it's pretty brilliant. You know, it's just, I love that it's so understanding of what this character is, what it means to storytelling, and what it means to the DC universe. And it's just like a fascinating read. I know a lot of people put it like right in their top 10 list, and these are people who aren't really even mainstream comic book fans or even mainstream superhero fans. They're just comic fans in general, and even they recognize it as an achievement. People who probably really kind of don't even give a shit about Batman. I think one of my favorite things is definitely Carrie. She's just like a brilliant reinvention of the Robin archetype that was around, of the teen superhero that comes along and adds a whole other dimension to the story. But in her case, she was different because, kind of like Tim Drake later on, she was somebody who more or less kind of actively pursued becoming Robin instead of kind of falling into it accidentally. And because of like her her true strength and her grit and like all this determination that she has, she really earns that, and he kind of sees it as soon as he meets her. That moment when like he's got her in the Batmobile and he goes, yeah, she's Robin. That's such a great moment because it makes sense, and it doesn't feel forced, it doesn't feel contrived. It's just, yeah, Carrie's Robin. Who else would be in this story? Like she's stepped into it very well. Beyond that, you see all Frank's like, usual staples, kind of politics holding back the way that we punish criminals. You got that like noirish vibe, the grittiness of like, that makes me immediately think of like, his Daredevil run. All this really cool stuff coming together for what is, some people would probably call the definitive Batman story. I wouldn't go that far. For me, that's year one or even 0 year. But yeah, this is what kind of started to affect the way people looked at Batman from that point forward. People realized, he was always a dark character, but the stories themselves are fairly dark. And it's a story about a guy just using fear to fight fear, and how is that going to change when superheroes die out and the world moves on and changes, and different philosophies start taking over. I guess the other thing to mention would be Joker in it, who, God, I love the way Frank Miller writing Joker is just a gift, because it's like he's been dormant because he doesn't know what the fuck to do to himself without Batman, and then he just wakes up as soon as like he hears that he's back, right out of this catatonic state. And it's interesting that it's like the whole, I think, third quarter of the story is just a fight against Joker. You'd think it would be the whole story or what the story was building up towards, but no, he kind of almost surprises you with the Superman fight. I love Green Arrow's sudden appearance and stuff. I love that he lost an arm and he's like, fighting arrows with his teeth and stuff. That's a really cool like visual representation of what the story is. Like, okay, we're taking these classic characters and we're throwing it on its head, so now you see a different version of it, and you see how it can be reinterpreted for like an R-rated audience. But yeah, I love Dark Knight Returns so much. Definitely like in the top 5 Batman stories. Not my favorite of all, but it deserves a lot of credit, and it's really fantastic.
Hi everyone. Christian has graciously asked me to comment on The Dark Knight Returns, which is one of my all-time favorite comic books. I actually bought Dark Knight Returns as a series in 1986. I was a teenager. I think I was probably about maybe like 14 years old, and I was an avid comic collector. But I was almost totally a Marvel guy. I had just started buying Swamp Thing, so that was the only DC comic I really followed, because at the time, DC was largely viewed as still being very juvenile, the whole sort of Super Friends thing, much more juvenile than Marvel. I remember Dark Knight getting a lot of press in the comic book fanzines at the time, magazines like Amazing Heroes. And I think there was even an article in the New York Daily News about it, which my parents at the time subscribed to. So I probably read about it in either of those publications, either through a newspaper article or more probably through fanzines. I was interested, and so I bought the first issue, and I was floored by it. It's hard to express how shocking it was to see an American icon like Batman treated in this way. Characters like Swamp Thing and the Phoenix, who were placed in a more adult context, I mean, that was interesting, but they were minor characters compared to Batman, because Batman was like, I had grown up with Batman, cartoons, comic books, the 60s TV show played all the time in reruns, endless merchandising. The first thing I noticed about the series was the stark mood of the comic. You can almost feel the oppressiveness of Gotham City and of Batman's worldview. The satirical tone was also very surprising as well. I mean, you had political, social, legal, media criticisms, and that was kind of startling to see in a Batman comic, something that you you identified with your childhood. To see the Reagan administration, talk show culture, pop psychiatry, the justice system so mercilessly critiqued, was awesome, especially to a teenager that was sort of questioning those things as well. Superman was a dupe for the jingoistic American imperialists. Something like that blew my mind. Again, I'd always thought of Superman as this sort of, the paragon of truth, justice, and the American way, and Miller found a way to really sort of turn that on its head. The art was also astounding. I was a big fan of Frank Miller and Klaus Jansson's art from Daredevil. But in Daredevil, their artwork had always been really realistic and gritty. I had actually started to see a change in Miller's artwork when he did Ronin. But, I was not prepared for the expressionistic, stylized artistry of Dark Knight Returns. It took a little getting used to, but eventually I loved it. And Miller became one of my favorite artists, along with Steve Bissette, John Toddleben, and John Byrne. The colors were also so impressive. I don't think I ever was aware of the importance of colorists until I read Dark Knight Returns and I viewed Lynn Varley's work. It's funny because I think at the time she was married to Frank Miller. I don't know if she still is, but they made a great team. The storylines were unbelievable. The way Miller was able to revive classic characters like Two-Face, Catwoman, Jim Gordon, but also keep their essential characteristics is really impressive. The new characters, like Carrie, right? She was really realistic. And also, too, she in a way that was reflected how teenage girls talked in the late 80s. The mutants were horrible. Really fearsome foes. And even in their depiction, and later on when they became the cult of Batman, right? Miller was satirizing youth culture. So again, his ability to take serious aspects and satirical aspects and sort of make them work together was just really, really impressive. And then, of course, the final battle, right, between the dark and the light, right, the Batman versus Superman. That was just epic, and it was everything that I hoped for. In the end, the light banishes the dark, but the darkness always comes back because without it, the light isn't needed. I understand that Miller has been accused, especially lately, especially after his comments about the whole Occupy Wall Street thing, is that Miller has been accused of being fascistic. And I think those kind of accusations really started with Dark Knight Returns, especially with his idea of vigilante justice as a form of democracy, which, again, unfortunately, we've seen quite recently. I personally don't think Miller's work is fascistic. It's much more libertarian, right? This notion of radical individualism being a way to address and to fight conformity, mass control, social domination, and benevolent dictatorships, so that's really important to him. So in a way, actually, Miller's work is sort of the opposite of fascism, right? Because he's saying sort of don't conform, don't fall into mass control, don't let society dominate you. So I actually think that, again, it's more libertarian than it is fascistic. Lastly, something that's kind of lost, I guess, if you're just reading Dark Knight Returns as a graphic novel, is that it originally came out in what was called, at the time, a prestige format book. And what that was it was a square-bound book that were much more glossy and much more substantial than regular comic books. So it made you feel like you were reading something with much more weight than a regular flimsy comic book. I've only read one of the sequels because I know Frank Miller did sequels to it. And whereas in the original series, I think that there's a great balance between satire and seriousness. But in the series that I read, which I think was the one after, because I think he's done two after, but the one after Dark Knight Returns, that new series to me was way too satirical for me. It was like Miller was making fun of everything about Batman and comics. Which is a shame because it feels like he's only doing the series for the money. If you don't respect this and you're making fun of it and putting it down, then obviously you're doing it for the money. And he's sort of biting the hand that initially fed him, right? Because I don't think without Dark Knight Returns, he probably would not have, been able to direct movies, right? He partially directed, I think, Sin City, and then I think he did The Spirit. So, I thought that was kind of disingenuous of him to sort of be making fun of it so much. So that's my thoughts on the greatest Batman story of all time, The Dark Knight Returns.
The Dark Knight Returns is one of my all-time favorite Batman stories, and also one of my all-time favorite stories in general. It's an epic tale of a Batman who may be getting old, but who's definitely lost none of his edge. At the very beginning of the story, he's reckless and just doesn't care about his own life. At the beginning, the urge to be Batman is a monster that Bruce needs to keep down with alcohol and by reminding himself himself why he retired. But eventually, the crime in Gotham gets so bad that he just can't resist the urge to fight it anymore. One of my favorite parts of the graphic novel is when he's watching the news and the reporters are all talking about the brutal crimes that have been taking place, and he finally snaps as a voice deep inside him says, "The time has come. You know it in your soul, for I am your soul. You cannot escape me." There's a line he says when talking about the recently released Harvey Dent. "We must believe that our private demons can be defeated." Which, he's obviously talking about himself as well as Two-Face, and it further shows he's got this battle within himself that he's obviously losing. I also like how brutal and sadistic this Batman is. He's been retired from crime fighting for so long that when he finally puts on the cape and cowl again, it's like a beast has been unleashed. He still doesn't kill, but that doesn't mean he's above torturing those who deserve it. He's ruthless, and one of my favorite scenes that shows that is when he's interrogating a member of the mutant gang, and the panels start out completely dark. The mutant gang member tries to negotiate with him, but Batman tells him that he's in no position to negotiate. And as he says this, the darkness in the panels is revealed to be Batman's hand, and it's covering the gang member's face. And when it's removed, it's revealed that Batman is holding this guy on the top of the highest spot in the city and relishing every moment of his terror. He even says that even though dragging him up there was a lot of work, his scream alone makes it all worth it. I mean, I think this was one of the first Batman stories to show that Batman may be just as psychotic as the criminals he fights. This Batman enjoys the thrill of the fight and dealing out punishment to those who deserve it. And I think this is most evident during his final battle with the mutant leader when he tells him, "You don't get it, boy. This isn't a mud hole. It's an operating table, and I'm the surgeon." That's definitely one of my favorite lines in the story, and every time I hear it or read it, it just gets better and better. I also really enjoy how Frank Miller handled the Joker in this story. This version of the Joker has been catatonic ever since Batman disappeared, and when he finally wakes up after Batman has resurfaced, he becomes a ticking time bomb just waiting to go off. The Joker's relationship to Batman in this story is a symbiotic one. Without Batman, the Joker doesn't have a reason to go on, hence the catatonia. In a way, this version also seems to love Batman, as he constantly refers to him as darling and seems to be desperate to reunite with him, even if it is in a battle to the death. He's a bit more subtle for a lot of this story than other incarnations are, and I think that works well for this version. It's like he's got all this craziness pent up inside him, and it's just building and building until he finally goes on a brutal crime spree that has him doing some really heinous things that show that he's truly making up for lost time. The Joker being able to get to the point where he's once again killing innocent people, in my opinion, just shows the ineptitude of the mental health system in the story. This is best exemplified by the character of Dr. Bartholomew Wolper, who's trying to, quote-unquote, cure his patients, and also get his name in all the medical books. I remember an interview with Michael McKean, who voices him in the animated adaptation, and I distinctly remember him saying, "Dr. Wolper is a very good doctor, if you ask him." That comment definitely rings true. He has an ego the size of a skyscraper, and it's that ego that the Joker is easily able to exploit in order to get out of Arkham.
I gotta say, the Joker really does some of his most horrible things in this story. Batman even goes so far as to say that he's killed a lot of people by letting Joker live. I can't forget to mention the way Miller handles Superman. This version, Superman is a lackey of the US government, and he's constantly doing their bidding, even though that means killing countless people in the name of the American way. He's still sympathetic, though, as it's revealed that he secretly despises being Reagan's puppet, but he also sees it as the only way to keep doing good. I recently watched a documentary on The Dark Knight Returns, and in it, Frank Miller said that he never understood how Batman and Superman could be friends, so he made them fragile allies that grudgingly tolerated each other. He also said that ever since he was a kid, he's wanted to see Batman kick Superman's ass, so with this graphic novel, he definitely made his wish come true. You do feel sorry for Superman, because at the end of the day, he's just trying to do what he believes to be the right thing, even though the US government's way is heavily flawed. There's a line in the animated adaptation that isn't in the graphic novel, but I think it still applies all the same. It's during the fight between Batman and Superman, and Batman questions Superman's loyalties. He says, "You say you answer to some sort of authority. They only want me dead because I'm an embarrassment. Because I do what they can't. What kind of authority is that?" Now, this is a very good point Batman makes, as the U.S. government really does only want him dead because he made them look bad by preserving order in Gotham during the blackout when the U.S. government couldn't maintain order in other parts of the country. In the documentary I saw, it was mentioned that Frank Miller wanted to show that the American way isn't always the only way, or always the right way. The U.S. government doesn't care that Batman's doing good because he's not doing it their way. And I think this, along with Watchmen, was the first story to bring superheroes into the real world and show that their actions have major consequences. In a way, this story also shows the negative repercussions of Batman. Yes, he does a lot of good, but he also inspires a bunch of young punks who call themselves the Sons of Batman to commit acts of violence in his name, and, of course, his return brings back the Joker. So, in a way, this story seems to be suggesting that Batman, and maybe superheroes in general, can be a double-edged sword. Still, though, I personally was always on Batman's side. All in all, this is just an amazing graphic novel, and one that I highly recommend reading if you haven't already. It's a must for Batman fans, and really adds more layers to his character. With this story, Frank Miller cemented his status as a comic book legend, and I had the pleasure of meeting him at a signing he did back in 2018. I had to wait on a long line outside in the freezing cold while hail rained down on everyone. But he was still very nice to me, and I got him to sign a new edition of The Dark Knight Returns, and also my copy of The Dark Knight Returns Blu-ray. They unfortunately didn't allow pictures, but it was great to meet him nevertheless. I also met Peter Weller, who voiced Batman in the film adaptation. He told me that Heath Ledger was a pal of his ever since they worked together on The Order, and that he was a real sweetheart. And I also met Michael Emerson, who voiced the Joker. I gotta say, his voice was spot on for that version. I also met Michael McKean, who voices Dr. Bartholomew Wolper, and got him and Michael Emerson to sign a picture from the animated film. I'm sure there's a lot from the graphic novel I haven't mentioned, but nevertheless, I hope you all enjoyed my review, and I hope you all continue to be well and stay safe.
Hey, this is Chris Espinal. I'm one of Christian's friends, and I'm here to help him do his review on Batman Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller. When I first came across this book, I thought it was pretty sick. It was very, very, telling. So some of the few things that I really like about the book was the overall tone of it. I mean, it depicts Bruce Wayne. He haven't been Batman for quite some time. I mean, he's been out of touch with himself. Psychologically, I think he had some emotional problems with the environment and how shit was going down. One of the cool things I liked about it was what draw him away was Jason Todd. What happened to Jason Todd? He haven't kept in touch with Dick Grayson. Gordon's about to go into retirement, and just a lot of devastating things have occurred. This new gang have pretty much took over Gotham City, have hold Gotham City ransom. People are just really off the wall, going crazy. But at the same time, the thing that I thought was really cool about Batman was his touch on mental health, and mental illness. It's really cool. It's almost like all the villains that Batman ever came across or ever had a problem with, ever fought against, Harvey Dent, the Joker, every person that is affected by him being inactive. When Batman was out of the picture, it kind of ruined them in a way. Their self of being, or whatever their purpose. It's almost like they were nothing without Batman. At the beginning, Bruce Wayne was kind of suicidal. He wanted to die. He didn't really have a purpose. He was being really disgusted with the environment and society. This is a little. I like the depiction of it, the way the whole entire Gotham City is. One of the few things that I liked about it was we had to go back in time for a bit. I wasn't born around this time, but I really liked how they try to capture everything. And the way the mutants are, the way everything is, it's kind of the way how New York City was. New York City and Frank Miller, some of the things that he went through, some of the things that so many people went through during this time. I mean, there's so many things to pick from. There's the violence during New York City. It was called Fear City. You know, Fun City, Fear City at a time. And if you go even further back, the Son of Sam, the murders, the stabbings, the rapes, the prostitutions. You know, a depiction of this, if you want a real depiction, if you were to look at Scorsese's Taxi, that's a real, like, when I seen that, and then I have some of my old friends tell me, that's really how it was. Alphabet City, the Lower East Side, that's really a gritty-ass place, you know what I mean? The Mafia, you hear the likes of Roy DeMeo, the DeMeo crew going rampant. You hear the likes of Tommy Karate, drugs, heroin, crack, the shakedown, the South Bronx, some of the violence that were happening, that was happening during these times, it was just crazy. And all of this is things that Frank Miller had to experience, and he engraved this into his book. The mutants are just a shadow of how the people were during that time. I love the fact that it took him to go into his deep, like his mind. It took him to really go through a lot of shit, open up a lot of darkness within himself. Some things that he repressed, like the flashbacks when he was thinking about his childhood, his encounter with a bat, and something inside of him is telling him, you got to do this, man. There's something inside of him, something that's been eating away at him. The conversations he had with Gordon, some of the crazy things, like one of the things that's a lot of people don't talk about is Gordon, when he was gonna retire, but one of the things that pushed him to it is when he had no choice but to defend himself when he killed a teenager. You know, it was self-defense, but that was pretty much it. He was done. He had enough. I thought it was really cool the way they did Harvey Dent. Like, the way that Harvey Dent was just, like, it was amazing. So Bruce Wayne used some of his money to do, like, facial construction on Harvey Dent and sort of change his face and try to fit into society. But even then it was a fail. Harvey Dent would never. Even with his fixed face, he felt like there was laughter. There was a lot of people that looked down upon him. He was actually more disgusted. He felt more of a monster with his fixed face than what he was previously, and that whole switch, that really grabbed me as well. Another thing that really grabbed me was the way the government was really using Superman as a deterrent for all the other countries, like all the communist countries and all the threats with the nuclear attacks. You know, I like the way that Frank Miller sort of used Superman in that sort of sense. The way I love that feeling, because I know how it feels when you're out of touch with something that you've been doing for so long, and then when you get back to it and you kind of feel alive again. You know, when Bruce Wayne took on Batman again, and he just felt like his younger self. He didn't feel any pain at the moment. He was just, you know, reborn in his own sense. And also, for him returning, he also brought in a lot of death, because an old friend of his or an old enemy of his also, in his return, his passion return, and we all know it's the Joker when he smiles and that grin where he finally has purpose. He was out of season 2. He had nothing. You know what I mean? You know, that was Batman in a sense is him. They're one and the same. He is truly nothing without Batman, and Batman is nothing without him and his perspective. And just to see Batman come in, and he just had this sparkle in his eyes. That's really an amazing experience reading it, and I just really loved everything about it. Everything about it.
Hello everyone. Christian asked me what my thoughts and opinions are on Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns. Batman Year One is my favorite Batman comic book / graphic novel of all time. This is my second favorite Batman comic book / graphic novel. This comic book really did an amazing, fantastic job getting out of their comfort zone and doing something different and original with Batman. At this point in time, in Batman comic books in the 1980s, they wanted a more serious Batman comic books. Frank Miller's Batman comics made Batman darker. My father tells me how Batman comic books in the 1980s were much better than what he grew up reading back in the 1960s. I love how Frank Miller made Batman very gritty, brutal, tough, and cool compared to past Batman comic books. The mutant gang that he fights is like Mad Max meets Batman. I also like how Frank Miller, unlike the past of Batman and Superman's friendship in the past in the original comic books, where they are best friends. In this, they're not technically friends, they have like respect for each other, but don't really trust each other. The fight between them is awesome, epic, and one of the best showdowns in comic books. Thanks, Christian, for asking my thoughts and opinions on The Dark Knight Returns, Frank Miller's graphic novel. Hope you enjoyed.
The thing I gotta get out of the way about The Dark Knight Returns is a debate I've had since forever with comic book fans, which is whether or not Frank Miller's artwork is good in this book. I am not a fan of the artwork in this book. Frank Miller has done good artwork. On Daredevil, he was fantastic. I have all the volumes of that. I even had the issues before I had the volumes of his Daredevil run. And those were beautiful. I didn't mind it at all. The way he drew Daredevil, the way he drew Elektra, the way he drew New York City, the way he drew Bullseye, just great. I love it. In this one, why he decided to draw Batman in this style, I don't know. This style works for Sin City for some reason, but for some reason it doesn't fit Batman to me. I don't know. It's not my style of artwork for Batman. Like, when I look at Batman art, I think like Neil Adams is the greatest Batman artist that ever existed. I think most people agree about that. But there are people who say that it does fit because of the fact that this is an ugly, gritty story. My only problem with that is, Killing Joke is a very dark, gritty, ugly story, and yet the artwork is beautiful. And the artist was able to, show you dark, gritty stuff without having to look so ugly, without having to look so crazy. It's almost like Frank Miller doesn't know how to draw a human being the way some of these people are drawn. I don't know. I'm just not a fan of it. I used to like it when I was a kid because this was one of the only comic books I ever owned. Graphic novels, actually. I owned a lot of comics, but graphic novels are very expensive for me, so I couldn't get many of them. So whenever I did, I would read them over and over and over again. So I probably read this book over 50 times in my life, because I would literally just read it and then read it again after I was done with it, because I enjoyed it so much. But nowadays, when I look at other people, how they've drawn Batman, especially Greg Capullo, like I said, Neil Adams, those people draw Batman fantastically, Jim Lee, and I have no problem with their artwork. For some reason, I can't get over the artwork these days. It just looks really, really ugly. And even to the point where, like, I watched the movie Dark Knight Returns, which I love. I love the movie. And I feel like that artwork would have fit this better than what Frank Miller did. It's just really ugly. And then especially if you read the sequels are just disgusting. Story-wise, that's a whole other issue, but artistically, I just can't get over the artwork. However, it doesn't stop me from reading the book. I really enjoy The Dark Knight Returns. This is one of the greatest Batman stories ever. It's not my favorite. My favorite is The Killing Joke, but it definitely is one of the best. It's one of the quintessential Batman stories. Yes, I prefer a less psychotic Batman. I prefer the Neil Adams Batman, who is basically As other people have described him, James Bond with a cape. That's my Batman. But hey, if you like this Batman more, that's fine. That's fine. You could like whatever you want. Everything is subjective. But yeah, that's another issue I kind of have with it. It's just that this is a very psychotic Batman. I'm not into the whole psycho Batman thing. I think Batman should be more controlled than that. But it's whatever. It's a simple story. It's Batman, basically, he's older now, and he sees that crime has taken over the city, and he wants to take it back. Simple. But a lot of things happen in it. And it's never boring. It keeps moving and moving, and the writing is beautiful. Frank Miller is a terrific writer, or was a terrific writer before what I call the Dark Age, which is now. Because nowadays, I'm not going to get into it. But yeah, his writing in this is great. It's noirish. I love his internal monologue. I love the dialogue. I think Frank Miller did a beautiful job writing Batman. He understands how to write Batman. I think that, there's nothing wrong at all with the writing. There's great lines in it, like "this would be a good death," "rubber bullets, honest," just a load of lines that will stick with you forever. Trust me, they will stick with you forever. I still quote some of these lines today. And I love how he took a more, not realistic approach, but just kind of a way to say that the comics that we had read about Batman before The Dark Knight Returns were basically like mythology. This is how people turned him into a myth. They made him seem so fun, or they made it seem so high-tech and all this stuff. But when you really look at it, like, for example, the bat on his chest. In this, they explain why he wears a bat on his chest. They explain why he wears the costume. They explain why the Batmobile was called the Batmobile. And then the Joker, when you look at the Joker, back in the day, Joker, yes, he was a serial killer, but he was very fun. He was a clown. He was very fun, a very entertaining villain that you can love. And this one, he is a very sick individual. And they show you what the Joker really is. That he really was a psychotic, piece of crap who was just, should not be admired and should not be loved. He's a psychopath. And then Two-Face, they show you that he's a really tragic figure. He's not just this really fun, colorful guy. He does have mental issues that need to be solved, and he can't solve them. These people, they try to fix him, and he struggles anyway because he's dealing with real mental problems. I love that Frank Miller took that take on it. It's beautiful, and I love how the friendship between Batman and Superman is complicated. It wasn't just like, oh, we're just friends forever, tight, fingers crossed. We're gonna be friends forever, we're buddies. Like, no, they have real issues with each other, with their own views. Some of them, how they see the government. Batman sees him as a sellout. He sees Superman as a sellout. I just love how Frank Miller took that and took it to a literal place that, not many other comic books at the time had ever done. So I enjoy that amazingly. And then without doing what Alan Moore kind of did, because what Alan Moore did was pretty much, he took the concept of the superhero and said this is a bad thing. Now, yes, I agree with him, Alan Moore, but I do like that what Frank Miller did was, he put some positivity in there. I think he put a positive twist on Batman and made it that, this guy can be a good symbol for people to look up to. Especially later on when there's nuclear, threats and just craziness. I think he did a really good job of doing that. The fight between Batman and Superman, I know everybody loves it. I love it too, but at the same time, it's been my argument forever that Batman, and I'm going to get very nerdy right now, Batman would never beat Superman in a fight. I don't care what I don't care what happened to make them fight, and I don't care what happened to make Batman win. That would not happen. Superman would beat the crap out of Batman before he even looked at him. Superman is faster than a speeding bullet. He can show up in another country in minutes, maybe seconds. There's no way Batman would even get one hit on him. But whatever, it's a comic book. You get over it, you enjoy it anyway. And I do. I really love this book. It's written beautifully, like I said. It's paced very well. I think everybody who's looking to get into comics or is into comics but has never read it, but they're fans of Batman or something like that, definitely check this one out. It's one of the greatest stories ever written. And thank you so much. Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed my friend's takes on this graphic novel, and I hope you enjoyed this video overall. That was my review on Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, and bye.